What would you say if I asked you who was the most famous Roman? Although us history nerds might think of Julius Caesar, Nero, or Marcus Aurelius, the reality is that there's one man who would outrank these figures enormously. In fact, 2 billion people around the world mention this man's name and discuss his actions on a regular basis. I'm talking, of course, of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. The man who apparently killed God. But despite his enormous reputation, most of us don't really know much about him. So, in this video, we'll dive into his background, his life work, and ultimately, the signature event, the trial of Jesus Christ. However, for most of this video, we'll be looking at the non-biblical sources on Pontius Pilate, since they tell us way more about his general life and conduct, and of course they're listed below in the description. The only hair in the soup, though, is that these sources only start from when Pilate takes up his post in Judea. So we're going to have to try and connect a few dots to paint a picture of his life before he becomes governor. However, in order to prove that I'm not just making stuff up, I am going to have to show my working out here, but I promise I'll do my best to not get too sidetracked, and so with that, let's get cracking. So, Pilate was probably born sometime around or just before the turn of the era. This is a bit of an educated guess, but here's the logic. We know that Pilate took up his post as the governor over Judea in 26 AD, and we also know that the typical age at which someone would take on a position like this would be between 25 to 40 years old. So we can be relatively confident that he was born around 10 BC to 1 AD, something like that, but feel free to take that with a generous pinch of salt. So we've got his date of birth, ish, and we also have his name, ish. See, the Romans typically had 3 names. For instance, Gaius, Julius, Caesar. You can see we have the praenomen, nomen, or cognomen, or first, middle, and last name. With Pontius Pilate, though, we only have the middle and last name. The first name isn't known, although I have seen some people saying with quite a lot of confidence that it was Marcus, although I can't find any sources to back that up. Luckily for us, though, the first name is actually the least important, but the second 2 names give us some major clues. See, unlike English, in Roman, your middle and last names are swapped. So in English, I'd be Jake Presley Clapham, but in Rome, I'd be Jake Clapham Presley. So his first name might well be missing, but the second name, Pontius, gives us loads of information since that name represents his family or clan. Pontius is a plebeian or peasant name. We know this since one of his family ancestors, Pontius Aquila, was a tribune of the plebs. In order to be a tribune of the plebs, you must have been from a plebeian or peasant family, and so if Pontius Aquila was tribune, he was also pleb. But bear with me because it gets more interesting. Pilate's family ancestor, tribune of the plebs Pontius Aquila, participated in the plot to assassinate Julius Caesar in 44 BC. But by 26 AD, some 60 years later, Pontius Pilate finds himself governor of Judea. However, in order to be a governor, Pilate would have had to have been an equestrian, not a pleb. Which could very likely mean that Pontius Pilate did something in his early life, which led to the mother of all promotions, taking him from a pleb, the bottom rung of Roman society, to the prestigious middle management class of the Roman Empire. And what makes all this even more interesting is that we can take a guess at what earned him this promotion by taking a look at his name again. Remember when I mentioned that in Roman naming they would swap the order of the last and middle name? Well, there's also one more detail to remember. Your last name, the one your friends and family give you, is usually based on a characteristic, personality trait, or feature. Pilate, or Pilatus in Roman, means something like skilled with a javelin, the Roman word for javelin being pilum. And this is something that would suggest that Pilate was able to demonstrate something on the battlefield that led to his extreme promotion. And if this is true, then according to historian Alexander de Mont, this probably happened somewhere up by the Rhine or the Danube, where he was most likely stationed with a local Roman legion. So, what's in a name? Turns out, quite a lot. from just 2 words, we can make a relatively educated guess as to his occupation, original social class, and his meteoric rise from pleb to governor. So here we can picture Pontius Pilate, aged 25 to 40, with a decent degree of military experience and success behind him, a promotion to equestrian class, which also means a good level of education, and some solid political connections to boot. And honestly, after quite a bit of research, that's the best picture we can build before he takes up in Judea. By 26 AD, Rome's 4th governor of Judea was moving on, either posted elsewhere or approaching retirement, and that means that there's a brand new job opening up there. It's not the most prestigious post in the empire, but it's a good start for an aspirational statesman, and we don't know why, but it's decided that Pontius Pilate, now a prefect, would be the best man for this job. Although the role is primarily diplomatic and administrative, keeping Judea in line with Roman rule would require a fair bit of muscle. Jerusalem is a hotbed of rebellion, civil unrest, and violent riots, and so whoever was going to govern this province would need to be able to take control with ruthless efficiency. Pilate, in typical Roman style, would be more than happy to let the sword do the talking, and from day one of his governorship, he got straight to work. This military experience beforehand and the needs for a military muscle man to rule Judea may have been what got Pontius Pilate the post, but again, we really don't know. However, once he gets to Judea, the ancient sources start to write about him, so we get a much better picture. But be warned, they're not too keen on him. The historian Josephus tells us that he was a man who, because of the brutality of his administration, had aroused the hatred of the people. But for Pontius Pilate, popular acclaim wasn't really a priority. You see, throughout his governorship of Judea, he spent most of his time in Caesarea, far away from the unruly crowds in Judea's capital, Jerusalem. Unlike the bustling, chaotic sprawl of Jerusalem, Caesarea was quite peaceful. The city itself was a Roman outpost, and so it would have functioned more or less like any other port town in the Italian homeland. It was a host to all kinds of comings and goings, extremely metropolitan, and relatively safe and wealthy. It was from Caesarea that Pontius Pilate conducted much of his official duties, and he figured that here, far away from Jerusalem, he could more or less act with impunity without having to fear a major uprising or any real threat against his person. As a soldier first and a diplomat second, Pilate was brutally insensitive to the local Jewish culture, regularly causing serious insult and ignoring the appeals of the locals. See, elsewhere in the Roman Empire, subjugated people were forced to add the Emperor of Rome to their own lexicon of gods and deities. But since the Jews were monotheistic, they refused to recognize any god but their own one, which becomes a source of continual frustration for both sides. Pilate was angry at the insubordination of the Jews and doubled down on his efforts to force the Jews to bend their knee to their new Roman god. He simply couldn't understand what the big deal was about adding just one more god to their religious practice. Of course, for the Jews, who have only the one God, any request to add an additional deity, let alone one who was a human ruler on earth, was basically unthinkable. And each time the Romans tried to force this new god down their throat, caused all kinds of, chaos. This gave rise to a series of back and forths between Pilate and the Jewish leaders, with Pilate routinely taking things one step too far. Josephus tells us of a scandal in which Pilate had confiscated Jewish temple funds in order to build an aqueduct. Now, Pilate took the sacred money of the Jews and employed it in bringing a current of water in Jerusalem and did many other things of this nature. As you can imagine, even if it's for public infrastructure, stealing religious money to build Roman-style engineering projects was a recipe for more anger and resentment in the region, and each time the locals lashed out, Pilate would put the screws on them and make an example out of any complainers. On one occasion, while visiting Jerusalem himself, a mob came to confront him about this issue of the stolen temple money, and Pilate's response was to simply have his troops pacify the mob with wooden clubs, beating many of them to death. Philo of Alexandria is even less impressed with Pilate, writing about his corruption, his acts of insolence, his rapine, his habit of insulting people, his cruelty, his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. But despite his unpopularity with the locals, Pontius feels confident to just plough ahead. See, living in Caesarea, far away from Jerusalem, he's pretty confident he can throw his weight around. He doesn't have to worry about being in the way of any fear or public uprising that happens in the capital, and so he's basically there snubbing Jewish religion in favour of his own Roman religious practices. The historian Daniel R. Schwartz argues that Pilate's complete stubbornness and religious zeal created underlying tension between governor and governed, now and again breaking out in brief incidents. At some point, however, things do come to a head in an event known as the Incident of the Shields. Basically, after getting increasingly frustrated with the Jews refusing to worship the Roman Emperor Tiberius, Pilate takes it upon himself to force it upon them by taking a load of shields adorned with religious iconography and portraits or standards of the emperor himself, and then marches these shields into Jerusalem and places them either into the temples themselves or into the palace of Herod. As you can imagine, this is completely unacceptable to the Jewish population in Jerusalem, who now feel forced to respond. What happens next exactly depends on the source. Philo tells us the sons of Herod the Great, whose palace is now covered in these Roman shields, decide to go over Pilate's head and report this incident to the Emperor of Rome himself, Tiberius, who, upon receiving their letter of petition, tells Pilate to take the shields down and basically chill out, which he promptly does. The account from Josephus is a little bit different. In his version, the Jews march directly from Jerusalem and down into Caesarea, about a 2 or 3 day walk, and then they basically camp outside Pilate's residence in protest of these shields. After a few days of this, Pilate walks outside of his house and addresses the crowd that have gathered there and tells them to go and head to the arena, and they can meet there and have a chat and try and find a solution to this. But once everyone gets to the arena, he summons in his soldiers with their swords drawn and basically tries to intimidate the Jews into submission. However, the Jews respond by kneeling on the ground and gesturing to their neck, sending a message to Pilate that they'd rather die here and now than let this shield thing go unresolved. And so Pilate, realising he'd be responsible for a bloodbath if he lets this go any further, basically decides that he's better off just letting these people have their way. He calls his soldiers back and he removes the offending shields from the city. Whichever source is true, ultimately those shields come down, and for the first time since taking office, Pilate has had to bend his knee to the demands of the Jewish people, and whether or not he's pleased about this, it seems to have changed the tone of his governorship in Judea, and from this point on, Pilate will begin to rely more on diplomacy instead of just brute force, although, let's be clear, brute force is still a staple component of his governorship. However, this pivot to more diplomacy, of course, has a pivotal effect on what comes next for Pilate, the trial of Jesus Christ. At least, according to the biblical accounts. The historical reality is actually a little bit more complicated. During Passover in the year 30 AD, some say 33 AD, but either way, sometime around 5 years into Pilate's governorship, he finds himself in the possession of a Galilean carpenter currently accused of sedition, which is an attempt to undermine the Roman authority. It doesn't do the defendant any favours that many of those present simply call him the King of the Jews. For Pilate, there's only room for one king in town, and that's his own emperor, Tiberius. Sources disagree on whether or not Pilate gave an order for this rebel to be arrested, or if he came to Pilate's attention after he was captured. In the Gospel of John, it's recorded that 500 Roman soldiers turn up to arrest Jesus, but modern historians are pretty skeptical of this claim, and I must say, so am I. It seems unlikely that a Roman general or governor would send off 500 soldiers to arrest, one dissident rebel voice. Although, that controversy aside, the one thing that everyone can agree on is that Pilate did order the execution of Christ by crucifixion. We actually have a whole video on how that works, by the way, which is linked below. But even though there's a consensus on the judgment that Pilate passed on Christ, we run into disagreements again on the why. See, the biblical account paints Pilate as kind of powerless to act and forced to throw Jesus on the cross so that he can appease the Jewish elders who want Christ out of the picture for their own reasons. In the Bible, Pilate is quite impressed by Jesus and almost charmed by him, and he doesn't like the fact that he's got to die, and so when it's all over, he famously declares that he washes his hands of the entire affair. This reading of history is a bit problematic though, because it results in a lot of anti-Semitism. See, if the Jewish elders were the ones behind the execution of Jesus, and it wasn't Pilate who was responsible, then the Jewish people can be accused of deicide, which is the murder of God himself. And it sounds silly, but it's an idea that stuck around for nearly 2,000 years, leading to everything from casual discrimination to medieval pogroms and, of course, the Holocaust. It wouldn't be until the 20th century that Pope Paul VI would undo these 2,000 years of anti-Semitism when he officially changed the Roman Catholic Church's position. See, in 1965 he released a document called the Nostra Aetate, which stated that the Jews were not responsible for the death of God on earth, and that the Jewish people should no longer be held collectively responsible for his execution. Better late than never, but there we are. Putting that can of worms aside though, we do also need to take a look at the non-biblical sources on the trial of Jesus Christ, because they paint a very different picture. They tell us that for Pilate, the trial of Christ was in all reality just another day at the office, and that it held no real special significance for him. He didn't have any special exchanges with Christ before the trial, nor was he particularly impressed by him. There's no record that he tried to demonstrate any reluctance about the execution of Christ and these kind of things that we often hear about, at least in the Gospel accounts. Philo of Alexandria describes Pilate as short of temper, authoritarian, and quite comfortable with violence. Josephus describes Pilate as a governor who had absolutely no qualms about upsetting the Jewish elders and who was stubborn in all of his dealings with the locals. If you take these two sources at their word, it seems unlikely that Pilate, this stubborn, uncompromising, authoritarian governor, would have executed someone that he didn't want to, just so that he could appease the Jewish elders. Those same elders, by the way, that he'd spent the last 5 years winding up and ignoring at every turn. The majority opinion from modern scholars, based off of the non-gospel sources, is that Pilate probably didn't feel too strongly either way about executing or not executing Jesus. The thing that probably got Jesus executed in the first place was that whole King of the Jews thing, and for Pilate there was only room for one king in town, and that was enough to have him executed. We don't know more than that. In fact, the only Roman source we have on Pilate comes from Tacitus, but unfortunately he doesn't give us any insight into Pilate's emotional attitude or motivations during the trial of Christ. He just gives us the outcome. Christ suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. So that's the big bit, the trial of Christ, but then the sources go a bit quiet on Pontius for the next 5 or so years, and we don't get another concrete bit of information again until around 36 AD, when he was removed from his governorship of Judea after he slaughtered a bunch of Samaritans who were looking for relics left behind by Moses. We're not sure if Pilate saw the Samaritans as a threat to the Roman order, or if it was just another example of his religious persecution. But nonetheless, it was seen by his fellow Roman administrators as way over the line, and so the governor of Syria, Lucius Vitellius the Elder, wrote a letter of complaint to Emperor Tiberius. And with that letter, Pilate was recalled to Rome to explain himself and his violent rampage against the Samaritans to his emperor. However, by the time Pilate had made it from Judea to Rome, Tiberius had died. And so Pilate's trial was supposed to be overseen by the next emperor, Caligula. But we're not sure if that ever happened, since new Roman emperors had a habit of just batting off all of the outstanding affairs from the previous emperor and starting their reign with a nice clean slate. One way or another though, Pilate's time in Judea was over, either because his hearing with Caligula had gone awfully, or because it was time to look for a new job somewhere else, or simply because he'd made a lot of money in Judea and now it was time for him to retire. Which brings us to the closing chapter of Pilate's life, his death, which is somehow even more contentious than anything else before, but I will try to keep it brief. According to church historian Eusebius and contemporary historian Daniel Schwartz, Pilate took his own life sometime around 39 BC, around 2 or 3 years after the end of his governorship in Judea, which does suggest that he had a somewhat painful fall from grace after coming back to Rome, possibly after a pretty negative trial with Emperor Caligula. Neither Josephus, Tacitus, or Philo, the main sources we've used throughout this video, actually mention anything about Pilate's death in their works, although it is worth mentioning that Philo discusses Pilate as though he were already dead in his writings The Embassy to Gaius, which is written a few years after the end of Pilate's governorship, around the same time that Eusebius and Schwartz reckoned he offed himself. So that might be a clue there. The contemporary historians Paul Mayer argues that there are no strong resources on Pilate's death, and that it's reasonable to assume he basically just lived out his sunshine years as a wealthy retired governor, whereas the 2nd century philosopher Celsus and the apologist Origen openly state that nothing bad happened to Pilate after Judea, again implying a relatively peaceful outro to his life. And talking of outros, that's all we have time for today, but that's the story of Pontius Pilate. At least as far as we could make out. If you think we got something wrong or we missed something, let us know in the comments. I'm by no means an expert on this area of history, but I thought you'd find it interesting. Anyway, I've been Jake, this has been Flashback. Thanks for watching, take care, cheers, subscribe, all that stuff, bye bye.